Pepsi Prebiotic Cola in original and cherry vanilla. That Pepsi taste you love with just 30 calories and no artificial sweeteners. Pepsi Prebiotic Cola. Unbelievably Pepsi.
It's not often you see a strongman politician with tears in his eyes. Yet as Viktor Orbán conceded his defeat in the Hungarian election this past Sunday, he did so bleary-eyed to his somber supporters.
A választási eredmény számunkra fájdalmas, de egyértelmű. A kormányzás felelősségét.
Meanwhile, in another part of town, a different crowd erupted in cheers and dancing, shedding happy tears as they received the news of Peter Magyar's landslide victory. It was an emotional night, but now the work begins, both for the winners and for the losers. The winners, Magyar's Tisza party, have the daunting task of reversing years of democratic backsliding that went on under Orbán's watch. That includes everything from his push to dismantle media freedom and judicial independence to gerrymandering the country's electoral system. Meanwhile, Fidesz and far-right parties across Europe have some intense soul-searching to do to figure out what went wrong in Orbán's campaign. So what Hungary will emerge from this changing of the guard? And what will this new leader mean for relations between Budapest and Brussels? And does this result signal which way the wind is blowing for other European populists? And for American ones, for that matter? I'm Sarah Wheaton, host of EU Confidential. Today, we're dissecting this consequential vote from the perspective of those who are looking toward the future, and those who are looking back to learn from their mistakes. Later in the show, we'll speak to Frank Furedi of MCC Brussels, a think tank with links to Orbán's government. He gives us a breakdown of what he believes went wrong with Fidesz's campaign. But first, a panel of guests who connect the dots between this vote and what it means for the rest of the world. Joining us from Washington is Politico's White House correspondent Eli Stokols, and from Paris, our senior France correspondent Clea Caulcutt. Here in the studio with me is Balazs Kos, a Hungarian consultant and expert on EU affairs. Okay, let's start off with a quick lightning round. What's the single biggest thing that this result changed overnight in Hungary, in Europe, in Washington? Balazs, in Hungary.
In Hungary, I think it's the approach to Europe. Hungary is becoming more European, and Hungary is on a more European path. There's a leadership now who actively supports that, and this is going to have repercussions. I mean, people voted for Tisza on the pro-European ticket as well, and there are a lot of young people involved in that. So,
okay, Clea, around Europe?
Well, in France, I think the biggest change that it's having is that we're looking ahead to a presidential election next year where Marine Le Pen, the far-right leader, is the favorite. And so here she is losing potentially, if she wins the election, of course, a major ally. And so that does undermine her transformation of Europe bid that she's got going.
Okay, so yeah, those two answers both really reflect each other. And Eli, in Washington.
Outside of Washington and the United States, no one is following the Hungarian election.
What?
I know, shocking. At the White House, really, now no one is talking about the Hungarian election because their person lost. There's been a lot of like, oh, we didn't expect him to win, and this is no big deal. But I think it can't be understated that the administration, the Trump administration, just lost its closest and most ideologically aligned ally in Europe. And that's not insignificant.
Balazs, you already wanted to react.
No, I just wanted to say that following J.D. Vance's visit to Budapest in the very final days of the campaign, even J.D. Vance said in Budapest that they're willing to work with any government. And 2 days after Orbán was defeated in Budapest, Trump just said last night that Peter Magyar is a good man.
We'll bring that back to Eli in a second. But for now, I actually want to hear more about the Hungarians. You were in Budapest on election night. What was it like to be there as the results were coming in?
So we went to the city center once the results were announced. It turned into a massive party. So people were celebrating. The streets were full of young people. They were very much hoping for a European future, for a better future for themselves. People actually revolted, I would say. Hungarians revolted in 1956. They also revolted in 1989. So on average, in every 35 years, there's also revolution. Everybody was out on the streets. It was a little bit like, I must say, winning the World Cup. Not necessarily the World Cup, but rather the European Cup, which I think Budapest and Hungary has definitely won that night.
All right. And you actually were making an interesting point to me offline about kind of the change in the voting demographic.
Fidesz has traditionally relied on older people to vote for them. And since they took power in 2010, obviously, unfortunately, some of the elder people died. But this also resulted in the fact that there are a lot of young people who reached voting age by the time of these elections who voted for Tisza. This was also one of the major contributing factors.
So other than this demographic change, what were the other top factors leading to Magyar's victory?
One of the most important factors was, I think, the enabling condition for a credible opposition to surface. And this happened 2 years ago. With the appearance of Péter Magyar and Tisza, this has happened. And after years and years, so since 2010, there was not really a credible opposition who could credibly topple the Fidesz government. This has changed 2 years ago. And once this was reached, basically what happened is that there were different topics that have surfaced. So, for example, you had corruption, you had the alignment with Russia, you had pro-European sentiments that came to the surface, and also you had other topical issues like the bad situation of hospitals that could actually add layers and layers of support to this credible opposition that came to the fore.
You know, when we see a landslide victory like this, we have to wonder if there is some sort of ideological shift. But is that what happened in Hungary?
People realized that they want to stay part of Europe. Tisza made it a choice. They made it a referendum on Orbán. And Tisza also made it a referendum on Europe. Tisza, or very early on in the campaign, they started campaigning on a pro-European ticket. And this was basically a choice because there were also conversations and talks about the fact that if Fidesz wins, there could be a chance for a Hugzit. So they would put it for a referendum.
That's like Brexit, but for Hungary.
Yeah, exactly. Now it sounds more of a joke. But a couple of months ago, there were still a lot of conversations about it.
On that note, as you're saying, Magyar really ran on this platform of restoring relations with the rest of the EU. And then shortly after his victory, he gave a 3-hour-long press conference where he kind of outlined his agenda. What will be the first moves that tell us about what the Tisza government is really about?
I think the press conference already showed this to a certain extent because it's about the credibility. It's about the fact that he stood there in front of the press for 3 hours. The first time he also gave the floor to journalists was for the independent journalists in Hungary, whom the government spokespeople are rarely allowed to ask questions. I think this already very much shows the approach that the government is going to take. They also had already published way before the elections, they published a long program that's 250 pages about their electoral promises that they're going to implement. So it was an open book. And now it's going to be about implementing it in a credible way and living up to the promises that they have made. And also the fact that Péter Magyar was on the phone with Ursula von der Leyen 2 times already, that shows the ambitions to really unlock those funds and to also start building up a cooperative government structure.
Well, yeah, let's unpack that more. Hungary has had quite a lot of EU funds withheld over various rule of law issues, various infringements of EU rules. What is the expectation now around Magyar getting those EU funds back?
Well, at the moment, there are conversations about the incoming government doing their utmost to unlock those funds. Obviously, on the other side, von der Leyen needs to be careful in order not to be blamed for the same mistake that she supposedly did with Poland. So my assumption is that the Commission cannot unblock the funds too quickly, but the mood is very cooperative, which means that if there are credible milestones, if there are credible commitments that can be made, then the funds could be unblocked. And Péter Magyar said in the press conference that he can commit to the European Commission already on 4 fronts: anti-corruption measures, including joining the European Public Prosecutor's Office, restoring the independence of the judiciary and investigative authorities, ensuring freedom of the press, and restoring academic freedom, including for research institutes and universities.
All right, let's move on to Clea. Magyar is trying to signal that he is ready to rejoin Europe. But as you were saying before, Orbán, he was a key ally of Marine Le Pen and the National Rally. You kind of mentioned that she's already looking ahead to being disappointed that there won't be another national sovereigntist or national populist at the table. But how is this being interpreted as far as her potential election victory?
Observers are kind of divided because on her political end of the spectrum, people are very much voting on national issues. And she has campaigned on bread and butter issues, which are the kind of issues that Peter Magyar actually won on. And also, her electorate are interested in what she's going to do nationally. So, on immigration, on welfare, all of those issues. So quite independent of the sort of international composition and what's going on in the world. It's very much sort of concentrated on more national issues. However, I think there is the sense that there's some sort of dynamic here that might have broken in Europe. I mean, we had the sense after, Donald Trump's re-election that maybe, this was the moment also for populist movements in Europe to kind of have their moment. So the AfD, the National Rally in France, and Orbán's defeat is kind of seen as, well, it's not quite so sure nowadays.
Super interesting. How is National Rally interpreting this at their headquarters?
It's a big loss, and it's particularly a personal loss for Marine Le Pen. Viktor Orbán has been around for a long time, and he has supported her, through all the ups and downs of her career. And she's seen many, she's a veteran politician here. And often she was declared sidelined, and he'd always be there with his support. And what far-right people tell me is there's a real relationship of friendship between the two. So it's really hard for her. And for the party more widely, what they're seeing is obviously that, having the support of the US Donald Trump, having the support of MAGA figures such as J.D. Vance, doesn't really help you on the campaign trail, because there's a sense nowadays that possibly, even though they are ideologically on the same page, when it comes down to, hard and fast interests, these diverge, and they diverge on issues that are important to voters, particularly voters on the right, such as, for the National Rally, it's going to be the price of energy and petrol. All of that are very important issues. And so they're thinking that it's a good thing not to get too cozy with MAGA, because obviously on the geopolitical sphere, things are not looking good.
And we saw Ursula von der Leyen congratulate Magyar. Of course, there's a huge amount of relief in Brussels that Hungary will stop holding up this loan to Ukraine. That's important. But as we discussed on the podcast last week, there's this kind of broader movement to reform how the EU makes foreign policy decisions and remove the ability for a single country to hold everything up. You're apparently hearing that the Le Pen camp is not so enthusiastic about these changes.
Yeah, absolutely not. They say that it's a kind of coup against democracy. What they fear is that Ursula von der Leyen will use the window between Orbán's defeat and their potential victory to kind of try and Le Pen-proof the system and remove the veto power of a country in the council. And so they are fearful of this because obviously, as they have lost Viktor Orbán, they could, if they came to power, become sidelined in the council.
You've also been looking at the broader far-right ecosystem with our colleague Netta Nustlinger in Berlin. How is the AfD reacting?
The AfD is, it's difficult for the AfD because the link with Orbán was very strong. The AfD has been on the scene probably not as long as the National Rally. And so for them, losing Orbán is losing somebody who gave them a lot of legitimacy in the debate. I mean, he was a European leader. That means something. And so you had, Alice Weidel, who was supporting him, saying he did a very good campaign. People voted on other issues, and she wasn't sort of turning her back on him. However, some do see, the links with the MAGA movement with the US at a moment when Europe is reeling under increased oil and gas prices because of the conflict in the Middle East, as being something that's kind of pushed him, did not do him any favors in the campaign. And so therefore, probably a lesson learned for other populist movements in Europe.
Okay, Eli, let's bring you back in here. As we heard from Clea, there's this sort of hesitancy now among these far-right parties to really get too close to the MAGA movement or really trumpet their links to Trump. How is that being absorbed in the White House? Do they see this as a problem for the MAGA brand?
Whether the president sees it as a problem, which the answer is no, or whether his political people see some cracks in the foundation, those are different questions. The president definitely is aware of European leaders like Giorgia Meloni going against him, as we saw in recent days about the Pope. He's frustrated about that. And, he's outwardly very nonchalant about Orbán's defeat. But I think, we've seen Nigel Farage criticize the president over the Iran war. So there are a lot of allies that were thought to be quite like-minded, quite MAGA aligned, who have taken issue with the president on different things. And I think he is absorbing those as personal slights. I think his political team may be looking at those with a little, closer, more scrutiny and saying, do we have a problem here? Of course, the politics team here at the White House, they're focused on the midterms. They're not so much worried about building this international MAGA movement. People like Steve Bannon, other sort of ideologues who had this vision of national far-right populism taking over the world, they may be licking their wounds a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, you asked Steve Bannon about this directly, right?
We did. And what he said is this should be a wake-up call, but he said this should be a wake-up call for the midterms, because I think of the parallels between why Orbán lost and why the Republicans are underwater here in Washington. The parallels are pretty striking. Orbán focusing so much on foreign policy and not the economic needs of Hungarian people. And Donald Trump has been criticized by former Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene and others for being so fixated on foreign policy matters in his second term and not focusing on what people thought he was going to focus on, which is the economy. There was a poll that came out this week, a YouGov poll, that showed 58% of the country think that we're on the wrong track. 57% disapprove, think the economy is going to be worse. I can't even recall all the numbers, but the data is bad, right? So the data is bad for Republicans here. And I think it's because President Trump was elected to do one thing and people see him doing the opposite. Gas prices are going up. That's a very similar situation to what drove Orbán out of office. And I think people around the president who can see those parallels recognize them and are very concerned.
Yeah, and that's the on-the-ground politics. But I think the other thing that's interesting is Orbán was this sort of beacon, I think, for a lot of the intellectual movement behind Trump. And so how is that going down in places like the Heritage Foundation to see what is happening to Fidesz?
I've talked to people in think tanks and people who have looked at this a long time, people who were excited about this transatlantic alignment and growth of, again, nationalist populist movements. They see this as shattering to the idea that the future for these kinds of movements, there was something inevitable to this future. They were able to tell people for a long time, like, we have the people's interests. We are the future. When Orbán is driven out of office, despite all the structural advantages that he created for himself, that is shattering to this idea that this is going to last forever. And you couple that to the fact that here in Washington, Donald Trump is grappling with the fact that this is his last term. And no one is really sure what MAGA is going to look like after Donald Trump is gone. So there is a lot of unease among those sorts of folks who are excited about that kind of this being a vanguard. And J.D. Vance said, well, we could read polls. We knew he probably wasn't going to win. President Trump gave an interview on Tuesday where he said, yeah, I wasn't really involved in this, forgetting that he had telephoned into the rally in Budapest that J.D. Vance was at, and suggesting that, the new guy looks great, right? And of course, the president sees a young leader who just won, and he's going to want to align with that person. But they are trying to gloss over the fact that they just lost someone who really provided the governing and ideological template that they followed when it comes to going after the administrative state, going after judges, trying to bully the media into submission. And people in MAGA-aligned think tanks here were open about how much Orbán served as a template or offered them sort of a how-to manual about how to go about this. They wanted the Orbánization of the United States. And, to some extent, we've seen that in the first term with the DOJ cuts, the standing up of ICE as a paramilitary force, the efforts to bully the media and to sue the media into oblivion. We've seen a lot of that, the out in the open corruption, the pay-to-play stuff with the ballroom and the president's crypto funds. So it's not as if Orbán hasn't had a real impact on this administration and on American politics. That can't really be underestimated at this point. But to see him lose, I think, is not insignificant, right? We don't know how much his loss presages a wipeout for Republicans in the midterms. I think we have other data to show that Republicans are headed for a big defeat here in November, or what it means about 2028. But there are striking parallels when it comes to the circumstances, the approaches that they've taken. I know some people in the White House are probably more concerned than they let on. And I think people outside the White House, that next layer of pro-Trump folks and think tanks and in consulting firms, they are very clear-eyed about what this may mean for them.
And so what are you going to be watching over the coming weeks and months? What's one clear sign that you might see that the sort of MAGA movement or Trump team are taking lessons to heart as opposed to just kind of crossing their fingers and hoping the same phenomenon doesn't happen in the U.S.?
The pattern has not been that when there's an obvious setback that they say, oh, we should adjust. Susie Wiles, the White House chief of staff, might say we need to do more speeches on the economy. She's been saying that since last November. That really hasn't happened, right? It's very hard for even a chief of staff as effective as Susie Wiles to manage up and control the president, whether that's his social media posts, whether that's what he wants to do with his time, his travel schedule. So are we going to see a major course correction? Are we going to see a rethinking of the national security strategy and the kind of Europe skepticism that is written into that document and to U.S. policy when it comes to criticizing mainstream European leaders for their approach on immigration, for their approach on energy, for not doing more on NATO? I don't think that's going anywhere. We've continued to see the president hammering NATO over what he perceives as their being a bad faith ally, not coming to his, to bail him out in Iran and coming to do whatever he wants, even though it's far outside of sort of NATO's mission, as is obvious to most folks in Europe. I just don't know that you're going to see the president take stock of this and say, this is really scary stuff. What can we do to avoid this fate?
And Clea, what is the Elysee, the current president, going to be watching to see whether Magyar is going to be a real serious European partner over the coming weeks and months?
Well, they're going to be watching whether he, after this sort of bargain that they are working on, that the funds will be released to Hungary, whether Magyar still plays ball on the European front, whether he continues to be a constructive voice on the different issues that Macron, the French president, wants to push forward. So whether it's on competitiveness or on defense, these are things you've got to remember that Emmanuel Macron is in his last year of his last term, and he really wants to have something to show for this last year, particularly because he's not doing much on the domestic front. So whether it's supporting initiatives on European sovereignty that might chime well with somebody who's, a conservative, even though he's not of the same hue as Viktor Orbán. So that's what he's going to be watching for. There's also a lot that he can't do, such as on enlargement. They know that anything that they do could be interpreted in the light of the next presidential election. And so that if he pushes too hard for a pro-European agenda, this might turn into a backlash and lead to more voters choosing for Marine Le Pen. So he's treading carefully as well. So I'm not too sure whether we'll see any grand projects that he'll be trying to push with Magyar either.
Really interesting reminder that people like Orbán and Le Pen do not have to be physically sitting at the summit table to have an influence. What are you going to be watching over the coming weeks and months, Balazs, to know if Magyar is the real deal or if he was just a good politician who can make a bunch of promises on the campaign trail?
What is clear is that he's not going to be an Orbán 2.0. He already committed to reforming the country, have a reset in Hungary relations, have an institutional reset within the country as well. He said that he's going to cap the maximum term of prime ministers to 2, basically essentially barring Viktor Orbán from becoming prime minister again. And you have the Tisza program that they published before the elections that is quite detailed, so the new government can be held accountable.
On the ground in Budapest, is there a sense that this is the end of Fidesz, or they just need to regroup?
There's a sense within Fidesz that this is the beginning of the end for Orbán. Loyalists started pointing fingers at him, former members of the government or members of the Fidesz faction. They started saying that he's responsible for this. If Orbán is barred from running again as prime minister for another term in the future as a result of the modifications of the law, then obviously need to find someone else within Fidesz who can do that.
We'll leave it there. Eli, Clea, Balazs, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, time for a quick break. When we come back, we'll be joined by Frank Furedi of MCC Brussels, a think tank that's been the intellectual voice of the populist wave here in the European capital. The organization has received millions of euros from sources linked to Viktor Orbán and has promoted Hungary's brand of right-wing nationalism by rejecting things like immigration and LGBTQ issues. Our guest will give us an autopsy of what he believes went wrong in Viktor Orbán's campaign. Don't go anywhere.
Chronic migraine is 15 or more headache days a month, each lasting 4 hours or more.
Botox, onabotulinum toxin A, prevents headaches in adults with chronic migraine before they start. It's not for those with 14 or fewer headache days a month. It prevents on average 8 to 9 headache days a month versus 6 to 7 for placebo.
Prescription Botox is injected by your doctor. Effects of Botox may spread hours to weeks after injection, causing serious symptoms. Alert your doctor right away, as difficulty swallowing, speaking, breathing, eye problems, or muscle weakness can be signs of a life-threatening condition. Patients with these conditions before injection are at highest risk. Side effects may include allergic reactions, neck and injection site pain, fatigue, and headache. Allergic reactions can include rash, welts, asthma symptoms, and dizziness. Don't receive Botox if there's a skin infection. Tell your doctor your medical history, muscle or nerve conditions, including ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, myasthenia gravis, or Lambert-Eaton syndrome, and medications, including botulinum toxins, as these may increase the risk of serious side effects.
Why wait? Ask your doctor, visit BotoxChronicMigraine.com, or call 1-800-44-BOTOX to learn more.
All right, now on to our conversation with Frank Furedi. Okay, Frank, briefly, 90-second version. What happened Sunday?
I think what happened Sunday is that the people said enough is enough. And unfortunately for Fidesz, their strategy, their communication strategy, their campaign was lacking in energy. It failed to capture the imagination of the public, and they underestimated the appeal that the Tisza party had. They continually criticized Tisza for being a one-man band. And what they didn't realize is that Tisza managed to capture the zeitgeist in a way that meant that they get an unprecedented turnout on the election day, a huge turnout on the election day, which led basically to the isolation of Fidesz.
When they said enough is enough, what did they have enough of?
You know, it's a strange phenomenon because on the one hand, it's 16 years of Fidesz was a factor. But I think people were desiring some kind of a change. And a lot of people felt that somehow things had stagnated, things have stayed still, and that the government was really not able to enthuse them or inspire them, and that the government had become to some extent isolated, which is true. And basically meant that when the election results were announced, millions of Hungarians felt that a burden had been lifted from them. And I was really surprised to hear the degree of exhilaration that a significant section of the electorate had, that somehow this was like not just a victory, but a kind of regime change.
And that is how Magyar has cast it. On the other hand, as one of your MCC colleagues put it at an event that you hosted the other night, Hungary now actually has the most right-wing parliament in Europe, as some of the left-leaning and centrist parties completely stood aside to support Tisza. Do you think that that reflects the ideological orientation of Hungary, or was it just that everybody kind of played a strategic game to get rid of Orbán?
I think there was a lot of tactical voting, and the left-wing parties realized that they were fairly marginalized in any case, and they were lacking in conviction and leaders. And at a certain point, they understood that Magyar had the ability and the capacity to actually defeat Orbán for the first time, because for 16 years, Fidesz was the beneficiary of a very weak, very immature opposition. It could easily just succeed, whereas this time there was a very real challenge. I don't necessarily accept that it's the most right-wing parliament, the right-wing government, because I think that instinctively the people on Magyar's lists are what I would call technocratic centrists. They would be comfortable in, let's say, New Labour as much as in a more right-wing political outfit. There's very few genuine conservatives within that rank.
Well, so let's talk about the genuine conservatives. What is the future of Fidesz and of Orbán? Can the party remake itself, and can he stay in charge of it, or is it time for new leadership?
Well, I think Fidesz has got some very difficult decisions to make very, very fast. It needs to make sure that it shores up its base. it's got to stop licking its wound, and it's got to ask some very difficult questions. And I think a lot of people I know in Fidesz who are critically minded are basically saying that it's time to get rid of the deadwood within Fidesz, because a lot of the people who were running as candidates were completely useless in terms of campaigning capacity. And now is the time to bring in a new generation of political activists. And the party needs to become younger. It's got to get rid of its tired appeal, and it's got to be able to, in a sense, go through the slow but methodical process of winning back the trust that it seems to have lost. I think Orbán is very much a positive asset for Fidesz. And whatever happens in the future, I think he'll be around for a while because he's in a unique position to act as a unifying force.
You've argued that the result in Hungary should not be interpreted as a bad sign for national populist parties around Europe like National Rally and Chega. So are there any lessons for them in the Hungarian vote?
I think so. I think that every single party in Europe has got to avoid the mistakes that Fidesz made, because the mistakes that Fidesz made are common to a lot of other parties, whether it's the AfD in Germany or Vox in Spain. There's a kind of complacency that's set in where a lot of the political leaders feel a little bit entitled that now it's my turn, now it's our turn. And they seem to imagine that somehow they have a God-given right to kind of move forward and for this populist surge to continue. I think it's very important. This is, for me, one of the main lessons from Hungary, is you got to listen to what the people are saying. You got to stay in touch with the passions of everyday life and not allow yourself to get into a bubble where you end up talking to people like yourself, which is what happened in Hungary.
And you've talked about complacency, but there was also a big corruption factor, no?
I think there's always a corruption factor in Central Europe, unfortunately. It was a factor in the election 4 years ago. But as long as people felt that they were economically reasonably well off, and as long as they felt that the corner could be turned, people would turn a blind eye to that. They would murmur and not be very happy about it. Whereas this time around, people felt that it was time to get rid of people who had lined their pockets, and that did become not a decisive but a contributing factor to the defeat.
So is that part of the house cleaning that you think needs to happen in Fidesz?
Yes, I think that's the first thing. But the other thing is basically, there's a lot of politicians who, in a sense, got into parliament and into high positions on the basis of contacts, on being part of a network, rather than on the basis of merit and talent. And I think that election proved that they were totally useless in terms of campaigning. I mean, when I think about the way in which Fidesz lost its base in the countryside, that was due to the fact that the people running for parliament essentially took a holiday rather than go on the streets and knock on the doors and do proper campaigning.
The Patriots for Europe are still the third biggest group in the European Parliament. That doesn't change at all in this election. How do you think their influence at the European level is going to change, especially without Orbán at the summit table?
I think that the Patriots will take a deep breath and ask some serious questions as to what this means for them. But I'm fairly convinced that this is just a relatively small hiccup, and that they're going to be able to maintain their forward momentum. If I look around the calculations that people are making, I think the Patriots will grow. I know there's very keen competition between the ECR, for example, and the Patriots, but at the moment, the Patriots consist of parties that have momentum, that are likely to make significant headway in the future. A lot depends on their capacity to become more mature politically, become more professional. But I'm convinced that there's no reason why the Patriots should suffer a setback, because, as I argued in a number of places, the political ideals that they stand for have not been challenged by anybody in the Hungarian election. That's the ironic thing, that nobody challenged the positions that are unique to the Orbán political orientation, strong borders, immigration, migration, multiculturalism. None of those things were challenged by Peter Magyar, for a very good reason, because had he done that, he would have been not necessarily able to gain that kind of majority.
Although he is going to be more open to at least not obstructing the EU doing things to help Ukraine.
Absolutely, and not just on Ukraine, on other things. He's very much Wonderline's wonder boy, and I think he's very much expected to basically play the role of a supplicant rather than as somebody who's genuinely independent. I mean, Hungary is not Poland, So Magyar hasn't got the resources that someone like Donald Tusk has, which is a major country. And I would imagine that in the short run, there's going to be a lot of strong collaboration between the Commission and the Hungarian government.
Historically, there's been strong collaboration as far as the intellectual movement and campaign strategy of Trump and the MAGA movement with National Populist Movement in Hungary with Fidesz. This was a bit of a hit for that collaboration as well.
I think that was a bit of a problem. I felt that it was weird that 2 weeks before the election, when everybody should be out campaigning, you would spend, days hanging out with J.D. Vance, valuable time. And I think that in general, there's a kind of misunderstanding of the role of geopolitics and of international connections and domestic ones. I think for most people in Hungary, as in Central Europe, domestic concerns are the ones that people really feel strongly about. I think that was underestimated, and it seems to me that the National Populist Movement, if it's serious about what it stands for, is going to take the national side more seriously, because its success depends on being able to voice the sentiments of people within that nation, within that national community. And if you forget that, and if you try to basically compensate for your relative weakness by hanging out with big international players, then you're going to be very disappointed.
Last question, what's next for you and MCC Brussels?
MCC Brussels is, one form or another, is going to continue. Obviously, the Hungarian government has decided that it wants to close down MCC as a priority. I got no idea to what extent they can do that, because it will involve breaking the law as it now exists. It would basically require some kind of constitutional change. But given what happened in Poland, that's not outside the realm of possibilities. But we decided at MCC Brussels that the work we're doing is really important. And if we feel that we are being pressurized to close down or they interfere with our work, that will regroup in a slightly different form. And myself and my colleagues will just have to learn the art of fundraising, find new sources of support for the future.
All right, well, courage for that. Thanks so much, Frank. All right, that's all from us this week. Make sure you subscribe to the Brussels Playbook podcast, the feed you're listening to us on right now, to get more in-depth coverage each Friday. And just a reminder for our regular listeners, we're going to be going through some branding changes in a few weeks, so you don't have to do anything. We'll still be right here on this feed, Brussels Playbook podcast. As always, you can reach us on our WhatsApp, the number's in the show notes, or drop us an email at podcast@politico.eu. Thanks to Diana Sturis, our supervising producer, and to audio producer Saga Ringmar. I'm Sarah Wheaton. See you next week.